Nietzsche, one of the most radical philosophers of the 19th century, believed that the moments when everything stops making sense aren't failures of life. They're signs that something is changing. For him, collapse doesn't indicate weakness. It doesn't indicate loss of direction. It indicates that the structures that sustained your life have begun to crumble because you've grown too big for them. We're taught to fear these moments, to see the loss of meaning as crisis, as error, as dangerous deviation. The entire culture conditions us to seek constant stability, absolute coherence, clear and defined purpose. But Nietzsche offers a radically different perspective. What if the breakdown wasn't an accident? What if it were a necessary passage? What if this emptiness that frightens us so much weren't the end, but the point where something more honest can begin? To understand this, we need to look at what really crumbles in these moments. It's not life itself. It's not external circumstances. It's the values, the beliefs, the identities that can no longer sustain who you're becoming. The collapse happens because you've come too far to keep living supported by the same structures. Think of a tree that grows beyond the pot where it was planted. The roots begin to crack the container. Not because the tree is doing something wrong, but because it grew. The pot needs to break. And when it breaks, it seems like disaster. It seems like everything is falling apart. But it's really just the necessary condition for the tree to keep growing. That's what happens with the values you carry. They serve for a while. They help you navigate the world. They give you orientation, structure, direction. But as you change, as you face experiences that these values can no longer explain, they begin to crack. And when they break, you don't just lose certainties. You lose ground. You lose the feeling of knowing who you are. Most of us try to avoid this moment. We try to fix the cracked pot. We apply patches. We put glue on it. We pretend it's still whole, because the alternative seems terrifying. Being without structure, without answers, without clear identity. But Nietzsche said that trying to hold on to what's already cracked is exactly what prolongs suffering. You can't grow and keep the pot intact. One of the two things needs to give, and usually it's not growth. Now think with me. How many of the values you carry actually came from you? Not from your parents, not from culture, not from religion, not from social expectations. From you. Consciously chosen. Tested by experience. Validated by your own life. If you're honest, you'll realize that most weren't chosen. They were inherited. Absorbed without questioning. Accepted as obvious truths, simply because everyone around you also accepted them. And this isn't an accident. It's conditioning. It's the way we learn to navigate the world when we're too young to question. Nietzsche called this herd morality. And before that sounds offensive, understand what he meant. It's not that people are stupid. It's not that they're passive by nature. It's that following the herd is the safest option, easier, less risky. When you act according to the group's values, you're accepted, validated, understood. When you question, you put yourself at risk. Risk of rejection, of isolation, of being seen as problematic. And it works. For a while, sometimes for many years, living according to inherited values works perfectly well. You fit in. You know your role. You have ready answers for the big questions. The people around you recognize you. They validate you. They understand you. But then something happens. It could be a loss, a disillusionment, an unexpected encounter, an experience that doesn't fit into the categories you had. And suddenly those values that seem so solid begin to waver. The ready answers stop working. This awakening doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual, slow, almost imperceptible at first. First you feel only vague discomfort, a feeling that something isn't right, but without being able to name what. You keep doing the same things, following the same rules, but with less conviction, with more doubt. And this doubt is deeply uncomfortable. It makes you question not just the values, but yourself. Is the problem in the values or in you? Many people get stuck in this phase, thinking they need to correct themselves, adjust better to the values they already have, work harder, be more disciplined, believe with more strength, try with more effort. But the problem isn't lack of effort. It's not lack of commitment. It's that you've grown beyond those values. They no longer accommodate who you're becoming, and no amount of effort will make you fit again in that space that's too small. This is the moment of crisis. Because it's not just losing certainties. It's losing identity. If you've always been the responsible person, the obedient child, the competent professional, the available friend, and these identities stop making sense, who are you? If the goals that moved you stop seeming important, what moves you? The temptation is enormous to fill the emptiness immediately. Find new answers, new values, new goals, anything that makes you feel oriented again. But here's the problem. Here's the trap that most people fall into. When you rush to fill the emptiness, when you can't stand being lost even for a moment, you end up just trading one prison for another. You trade old values for new ones, old beliefs for new ones, but you maintain the same relationship with them, the same need for certainty, the same inability to inhabit doubt, and eventually these new values will crack too. Because the problem wasn't in the content, it was in how you related to them. It's not just values that crumble, it's the narratives. The stories you told yourself about how life works. If you work hard, you'll be rewarded. If you're a good person, things will turn out right. If you follow your heart, you'll find happiness. If you do everything right, you'll succeed. These narratives function as mental maps. They tell you what to expect, how to act, how to interpret what happens to you. The problem is that life rarely follows these narratives. Life is more complex than that, more unpredictable. You work hard and aren't rewarded. You're a good person and you suffer. You follow your heart and get lost. You do everything right and still fail. And when the narrative fails repeatedly, when you see that the rules don't work, it begins to lose force. You begin to suspect that maybe the rules they taught you don't describe the real world. That maybe you've based your entire life on a story that doesn't hold up. Losing these narratives is frightening in a very specific way. Because they weren't just abstract ideas floating in your head. They were the structure that gave meaning to suffering. They were what made everything bearable. If you suffered but believed it was part of a greater path, that in the end it would make sense, that you'd be rewarded, the suffering was bearable. It had purpose. It had reason. But when the narrative falls, when you can no longer believe there's a reward, that there's reason, that there's greater meaning, suffering loses even that small compensation. It becomes just suffering, raw, without framework, without purpose, without reason. And here's something that's rarely said, something most people don't want to hear. The narrative doesn't need to be true to work. It just needs to be believed. Millions of people live entire lives based on narratives that objectively don't correspond to reality. And they live well, they function well, because belief in the narrative is sufficient to give structure, direction, meaning. The problem isn't when you have a false narrative. The problem is when you lose the ability to believe in any narrative, when you see through the game but still need to play. Nietzsche had a name for this stage, for this experience of emptiness that arises when everything loses meaning. He called it nihilism, but not the way most people use that word today. Not as a pessimistic philosophy that says nothing matters, not as a cynical attitude toward life. Nietzsche saw nihilism as an inevitable stage, as a necessary passage, a phase that happens when old values die but new ones haven't been born yet. It's the empty space between one form of life and another, between one way of giving meaning to the world and another. And that's precisely where the challenge lies. Because in that intermediate space, nothing seems to matter. Not because you've philosophically decided that nothing matters, but because the things that used to matter have lost force, and the new ones haven't appeared yet. It's like being in a dark hallway between two rooms. You know you left one place. You know that place doesn't serve anymore. But you haven't arrived at the next one yet. And in that hallway, you don't see anything. You feel nothing but disorientation. You don't know if you're going in the right direction or if you're just moving further and further away from any place. Many people interpret nihilism as a final destination, as if once you realize that values were constructed, that narratives were illusions, you were condemned to live forever in this emptiness. But Nietzsche didn't see it that way. For him, nihilism was temporary. It was necessary. It was the demolition that precedes reconstruction, the winter that precedes spring, the symbolic death that precedes rebirth. The problem is when you get stuck in it, when you make emptiness a permanent identity, when you settle into the position of someone who lost all illusions and now sees the naked truth that nothing matters. Nietzsche distinguished two types of nihilism, passive and active. And this distinction is crucial. It's the difference between decadence and transformation. Passive is the one that paralyzes, that makes you give up on everything, that convinces you that if nothing has ready-made meaning, then nothing is worthwhile. It's the nihilism of resignation, of weariness, of giving up. It's when you simply throw in the towel. You stop trying, you stop caring. Not by conscious choice, but by exhaustion. But there's another type, active nihilism. The one that destroys old values not out of weakness, but out of strength. That clears the ground not because it gave up, but because it wants to plant something new. This nihilism is destructive, yes, but its destruction is creative. It's like burning an old forest so new vegetation can grow. It's recognizing that some things need to die, so others can be born. The difference between these two types isn't in external circumstances. Two people can go through the same crisis, lose the same values, face the same emptiness, but one falls into decadence and the other uses it as an opportunity for transformation. The difference is in how you relate to the emptiness. If you surrender to it passively, as a victim, as someone to whom something bad happened, you tend toward passive nihilism. But if you can recognize the emptiness as a space of possibility, as an opening, as a chance to create something genuinely new, you're in the territory of active nihilism. If you're enjoying this content, you might also like our exclusive material that's in the first pinned comment. Why does emptiness frighten us so much? Why do we prefer to live with false maps than admit we have no map? There's something in the human mind that deeply rejects the absence of meaning. We can't simply exist without some narrative, without some structure, without some way of organizing experience. Pure chaos, total randomness, complete absence of pattern. This is unbearable for the human mind, so we create meaning, even when we know we're creating it, because the alternative is worse. But there's a fundamental difference between consciously creating meaning and living in an unconscious illusion. When you live in an illusion, believing it's absolute truth, you're vulnerable. When the illusion breaks, you collapse. But when you create meaning consciously, knowing it's a construction, that it's choice, you're in completely different territory. You're no longer waiting for the world to validate your beliefs. You're no longer dependent on external confirmation. You're taking responsibility for them. And that's precisely where the fear lies. The deep fear that most people don't want to face. Taking responsibility for creating your own meaning means accepting that you're alone in this. That no one is going to give you the answer. That there's no higher authority, no guru, no sacred book, no system that's going to validate your choices. That you could be completely wrong and never be certain. That's terrifying. It's much easier to follow a ready-made map, even if it's false, than to draw your own map knowing it might be leading you nowhere. The temptation to rebuild too quickly comes exactly from this fear. When you lose ground, when everything collapses, the instinct is to grab onto anything that seems solid. Any new belief system, new philosophy, new purpose. It doesn't matter much what, it just matters that it fills the emptiness. And you see this happening constantly around you. People who go through deep crises and immediately adopt new identities. They find a guru, a cause, a mission, anything that returns the feeling of having solid ground again. And it works, for a while. It gives structure, it gives direction, it gives the feeling of having found the answer. But these hasty reconstructions are fragile. They're sandcastles that the next wave will knock down. Because they didn't come from genuine transformation. They didn't come from a deep process of questioning and creation. They came from desperation at not being able to bear the emptiness. They're just old values with new clothing. The same structure, the same need for certainty, the same inability to inhabit doubt. And inevitably, sooner or later, they'll crumble too. Nietzsche said you have to endure the desert. Cross the emptiness completely. Don't try to escape it prematurely. Don't fill the space before it's time. Because it's only by fully inhabiting this space of uncertainty, this uncomfortable space where nothing is defined, that something genuinely new can emerge. Not as an answer imposed from outside, not as a system you adopt ready-made, but as a movement that comes from within, as direction that arises when you stop looking for ready-made directions. This doesn't mean you should cultivate emptiness. It doesn't mean making nihilism a life philosophy. It doesn't mean embracing the idea that nothing matters and staying stuck in it. It means recognizing that there are moments in life when you simply don't know. Don't know what to do, what to choose, what to believe, which direction to go. And these moments, however uncomfortable they are, however frightening they seem, aren't failures. They aren't signs that you did something wrong. They're transitions. They're the space between one form of life and another. And if you try to skip this transition, if you try to immediately return to certainty, you lose the chance to really change. Not every breakdown leads to the same place. And this is important to understand. There's a crucial difference between creative destruction and decadence. Decadence is when you fall and can't get up anymore, when the collapse progressively weakens you. Each day a little worse than the previous one. Gradual loss of energy, of interest, of capacity. It's downward movement that feeds itself and has no bottom. But there's another type of fall, creative destruction, that clears the ground, that removes what was old, rigid, dead, and opens space for something new to grow. Nietzsche saw this type of destruction as an essential part of creation, as a necessary condition for something genuinely new to emerge. You can't plant in already occupied soil. You can't build on already constructed land. You need to clear first. You need to let die what needs to die. The difference between the two isn't necessarily in what happens externally. It's in how you relate to the collapse. If you live it passively, as punishment, as something being done to you, you tend toward decadence. But if you can recognize the collapse as process, as transition, as opening to something new, you're in different territory. Not necessarily easier, not necessarily less painful, but with different direction, with different purpose. And this leads us to one of Nietzsche's most important ideas. An idea that may sound simple, but carries enormous depth. Become who you are. It seems paradoxical. How do you become who you already are? But that's precisely the point. You spend most of your life not being who you are, being who they told you should be, fulfilling roles that were written by other people, meeting expectations that were never yours, playing characters you didn't even choose to play. These characters work. They give you a place in the world. They make you be recognized, accepted, understood, the responsible son, the obedient daughter, the dedicated professional, the always available friend. They're identities you wear like clothes, that you use to navigate the social world. And over time, you forget their clothes. You start to think they're you, that this is your true identity. Becoming who you are means taking off these clothes, abandoning these roles, letting these fabricated identities die. And this implies loss, real loss, concrete loss, loss of recognition, loss of belonging, loss of external validation. Because the people around you know you by the roles you perform. They expect you to continue performing. And when you stop, when you drop the mask, they get confused, sometimes hurt, sometimes even betrayed. As if you broke an agreement they didn't even know existed. It's in the middle of this emptiness, this chaos, this absence of defined form, that creation becomes possible. Nietzsche said, "One must have chaos within oneself to give birth to a dancing star." And this isn't empty metaphor. It's precise description of how genuine creation works. Real creativity doesn't arise from order. It doesn't arise from control. It doesn't arise from well-organized systems where everything is in the right place. It arises from turbulence, from conflict, from tension between opposing forces that haven't yet resolved. When everything is organized, when each thing has its place, when you know exactly who you are and what you're doing, there's no space for genuine creation. There's only repetition, refinement, optimization of what already exists. But when you're in chaos, when old forms have dissolved and new ones haven't solidified yet, then you're truly free. Free to experiment, to fail, to try things that don't make sense within the old rules, to create values that never existed before. And there's a price that needs to be honestly named, a price most people aren't willing to pay. This path leads to solitude, not necessarily physical solitude. You can be surrounded by people, but existential solitude, deep solitude. When you stop following the group's values, when you start creating your own paths, you inevitably distance yourself, because the people around you are still playing the old game, still following the known maps. And when you question these maps, when you choose different directions, you become less understandable, less predictable, less comfortable. So how do you get out? How do you cross without getting stuck? Nietzsche had an answer that's simultaneously simple and radically challenging. Meaning isn't something you find. It's not something that's hidden somewhere waiting for you to discover it. It's something you create, that you build, that you forge. From your choices, from your actions, from your commitments. This changes everything. It completely changes the way you face life. Because it means you stop searching. You stop waiting for someone to give you the answer. You stop seeking external validation for what you do. You take total, complete, inescapable responsibility for the creation of meaning in your own life. And that's terrifying and liberating at the same time. And then, after crossing the emptiness, after enduring the desert, after inhabiting uncertainty without trying to escape it, something begins to emerge. But not the way you imagined. Not the way self-help books promise. Not as a clear answer. Not as sudden epiphany where everything finally makes sense. It emerges as direction. Vague at first. Almost imperceptible. So subtle you almost don't notice. Like a small inclination. Like a subtle impulse you can't rationally explain but recognize as true. Not because someone told you. Not because you read it somewhere. But because it resonates with something deep in you. With something that survived the breakdown. With something that remains alive even when everything else died. Life regains weight, regains substance. Not because you found the true meaning, the definitive answer, the ultimate truth, but because you're creating meaning through your choices, through your actions, through your affirmations. And maybe that's the only truth that survives complete breakdown. The simple but profound truth that you're capable of creating, of building, of affirming, even when there's no solid ground, even when there's no map, even when there's no guarantee. If you're going through this now, if everything seems to have collapsed, if you feel you've lost ground, I'm not going to tell you everything will be okay. I'm not going to promise you'll find definitive answers. I'm not going to offer easy solutions with 3 simple steps. Because the truth is they don't exist. There's no shortcut. There's no way to skip the process. You have to cross it. And it hurts. It frightens. It leaves you vulnerable in ways you didn't even know were possible. But I can tell you, and I say this with all the honesty I can muster, that this experience isn't failure. It's not a sign you did something wrong. It's not punishment. It's a sign you're in transition. That you've grown beyond the old structures. That you need new forms. Broader, more honest, more yours. And everyone who really transformed, who really created something genuine, who really became who they are, went through something similar. They crossed the desert. They inhabited the emptiness. They lost ground. And they came out the other side, not with all the answers, not without scars, not unscathed, but more alive, more authentic, more capable of creating meaning. The breakdown isn't the end. It's the beginning. It's not death. It's birth. It's not loss of meaning. It's opportunity to create meaning in a more authentic, more conscious, more true way. And maybe that's what Nietzsche meant from the beginning, that some things need to fall, not to destroy you, but to free you. If this video made you reflect on your own journey, on the values you never questioned, on the possibility of creating meaning instead of seeking it, leave a like down below, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. And always remember, you're not looking for answers that already exist somewhere. You're creating your own answers. And that's infinitely more difficult, but also infinitely more true. It's not just values that crumble. It's the narratives, the stories you told about how life works. If you work hard, you'll be rewarded. If you're a good person, things will turn out right. These narratives are mental maps. They tell you what to expect. The problem is that life rarely follows these narratives. You work hard and aren't rewarded. You're a good person and you suffer. And when the narrative fails repeatedly, it loses force. You begin to suspect that the rules they taught you don't describe the real world. Losing these narratives is frightening in a specific way. Because they gave meaning to suffering. If you suffered but believed it was part of a greater path, the suffering was bearable. But when the narrative falls, suffering loses even that compensation. It becomes just suffering, raw, without purpose. And here's something that's rarely said. The narrative doesn't need to be true to work. It just needs to be believed. Millions of people live based on narratives that don't correspond to reality. And they live well, because belief is sufficient to give structure. The problem is when you lose the ability to believe in any narrative. Nietzsche had a name for this stage: nihilism, but not as a pessimistic philosophy. Nietzsche saw nihilism as an inevitable stage. A passage that happens when old values die but new ones haven't been born yet. It's the empty space between one form of life and another. And that's precisely where the challenge lies. Because in that space, nothing seems to matter. Not because you decided nothing matters, but because the things that used to matter lost force. It's like being in a dark hallway between two rooms. You left one place, but you haven't arrived at the next one yet. And in that hallway, you don't see anything. Many people interpret nihilism as a final destination, as if you were condemned to live forever in this emptiness. But Nietzsche didn't see it that way. For him, nihilism was temporary, necessary, the demolition that precedes reconstruction. The problem is when you get stuck in it. Nietzsche distinguished two types of nihilism: passive and active. Passive paralyzes. It makes you give up. It convinces you nothing is worthwhile. It's the nihilism of resignation. But there's another type: active nihilism, the one that destroys old values not out of weakness, but out of strength, that clears the ground because it wants to plant something new. The difference isn't in circumstances, it's in how you relate to the emptiness. If you surrender passively, you tend toward passive nihilism. But if you recognize emptiness as a space of possibility, you're in the territory of active nihilism. And this isn't just philosophical difference, it's practical difference. Passive nihilism paralyzes you. You do nothing because you see no reason. You don't commit because you see no meaning. But active nihilism keeps you moving. You're destroying, yes, but you're doing it actively. And this movement prepares the ground for something new. If you're enjoying this content, you might also like our exclusive material that's in the first pinned comment. Why does emptiness frighten us so much? Why do we prefer false maps to admitting we have no map? There's something in the human mind that rejects absence of meaning. We can't exist without some narrative, without some structure. Pure chaos is unbearable, so we create meaning, even knowing we're creating it. But there's a difference between consciously creating meaning and living in an unconscious illusion. When you live in an illusion, believing it's absolute truth, you're vulnerable. When the illusion breaks, you collapse. But when you create meaning consciously, you're in different territory. You're no longer waiting for the world to validate your beliefs. And that's where the fear lies. Taking responsibility for creating your own meaning means accepting you're alone, that no one is going to give you the answer, that there's no higher authority that will validate your choices. It's terrifying, much easier to follow a ready-made map. There's something disturbing in realizing that meaning wasn't in things. It was in how you looked at them. It's like discovering you followed a broken compass. And if the directions were arbitrary, all the choices were too. Every sacrifice, every effort. This leads to a crisis of confidence. Not just in the world, but in yourself. If you completely believed in something false, how can you trust what you believe now? The emptiness isn't just absence of meaning, it's absence of confidence. It's losing the ability to believe with certainty. But maybe that's exactly what you need to lose. Absolute certainty, blind confidence, because these things keep you trapped, keep you dependent. And when you lose these crutches, when you stop needing absolute certainty to act, something changes. You become more flexible, more capable of navigating uncertainty. The temptation to rebuild too quickly comes from this fear. When you lose ground, the instinct is to grab onto anything solid. Any new system, new philosophy, new purpose. And you see this happen. People who go through crises and immediately adopt new identities. They find a guru, cause, mission. And it works. For a while, it gives structure, it gives direction. But these reconstructions are fragile, because they didn't come from genuine transformation. They came from desperation at not enduring the emptiness. They're just old values with new clothing. And inevitably they'll crumble too. Nietzsche said you have to endure the desert. Cross the emptiness completely. Don't escape prematurely, because it's only by fully inhabiting this space of uncertainty that something genuinely new can emerge. Not as an answer imposed from outside, but as movement that comes from within. This doesn't mean cultivating emptiness. It means recognizing there are moments when you simply don't know what to do, what to choose. And these moments aren't failures, they're transitions. And if you try to skip this transition, you lose the chance to really change. The rush to rebuild comes from not enduring vulnerability. When you don't have certainties, you're completely exposed. And that's uncomfortable. But maybe that's exactly the vulnerability you need to experience. Because in it, you learn something fundamental. That you can keep existing even without having all the answers. And this changes everything. You stop demanding guarantees. You stop needing constant validation. You stop waiting for someone to tell you if you're right. You simply live. Choose. Correct. Choose again. There's no perfect map. There's no path without risk. And when you accept this, you become freer. Not every breakdown leads to the same place. There's a difference between creative destruction and decadence. Decadence is when you fall and can't get up, when the collapse progressively weakens you, each day a little worse. But there's another type, creative destruction. That clears the ground. That removes the old and opens space for the new. The difference isn't in what happens externally, it's in how you relate to the collapse. If you live it passively, as punishment, you tend toward decadence. But if you recognize the collapse as process, as transition, you're in different territory. The difference between creative destruction and decadence is in the direction of movement. Decadence is continuous downward movement, but creative destruction has a bottom. You descend to a certain point, and then movement begins in another direction. And here's something that might help. If you're still seeking, still questioning, still trying to understand, you're probably in creative destruction, because true decadence is characterized by absence of movement, by total resignation. If you're reading this, you're still moving. And this leads us to one of Nietzsche's most important ideas: become who you are. It seems paradoxical. How do you become who you already are? But that's precisely the point. You spend most of your life not being who you are, being who they told you should be, fulfilling roles, meeting expectations. These characters work. They give you a place in the world. They make you be recognized, the responsible son, the obedient daughter, the dedicated professional. They're identities you wear like clothes. And over time, you forget they're clothes. You start to think they're you. Becoming who you are means taking off these clothes, abandoning these roles, letting these fabricated identities die. And this implies loss. Loss of recognition. Loss of belonging. Because people know you by the roles you perform. And when you stop, they get confused. But the paradox is that you don't discover who you are. You create who you are. It's not a hidden essence waiting to be revealed. It's a process of construction that happens through your choices. And this process can't begin while you completely occupy the roles given to you. The paradox is in this. You remove the false layers, the social conditioning, the internalized expectations, and as you remove them, something emerges. Something that was already there but was hidden, buried under years of adaptation. And this something doesn't come with a manual, doesn't come with clear description. It comes as impulse, as vague direction, as inclination you don't rationally explain but recognize as true. And following this inclination means disappointing almost everyone. And there's a period, after you abandon old roles but before creating new ones, when you simply don't know who you are. And that's terrifying. Because identity gives us a sense of continuity. And when that identity disappears, you're floating. Without anchorage. It's in the middle of this emptiness, this chaos, that creation becomes possible. Nietzsche said, "One must have chaos within oneself to give birth to a dancing star." Creativity doesn't arise from order. It doesn't arise from control. It arises from turbulence, from conflict. When everything is organized, when each thing has its place, there's no space for genuine creation. There's only repetition. But when you're in chaos, when old forms have dissolved, then you're truly free. Free to experiment, to fail, to try things that don't make sense within the old rules. The dancing star isn't solution. It's not definitive answer. It's the ability to create something alive from your own internal chaos. It's transforming disorientation into direction, emptiness into possibility. But this requires you to endure chaos, that you don't flee, that you don't try to organize it prematurely. And this goes against everything they taught you. But maybe stability isn't what you most need now. Maybe it's the courage to stay lost until new direction emerges. Chaos is fertile because in it, there are no pre-established rules. There are no ready-made paths. In chaos, you're completely free. And this freedom is simultaneously liberating and terrifying. But it's precisely in this fall that new things can emerge. Nietzsche called this amor fati, love of fate, not as passive resignation, but as active affirmation of what happens, including chaos, including destruction, because without these elements, there's no real creation. Amor fati isn't accepting everything with a smile on your face. It's recognizing that everything that happened needed to happen to bring you here, and that everything that's happening now, including the collapse, is a necessary part of something greater. Think about it. Every experience you've had, every mistake you made, every disillusionment, all of this brought you to this moment, and this version of you, however imperfect it is necessary. Because it's from it that the next version will emerge. You can't skip stages, you can only cross them. There's a danger that needs to be named, the danger of making collapse a permanent identity, of settling into emptiness. There are people who go through crisis and stay there. They transform nihilism into a posture. Because if you believe nothing matters, you don't need to commit to anything. You don't need to risk. You can stay in a position of cynical detachment. And that can seem like wisdom. But Nietzsche suspected it was just disguised fear. Nihilism is passage. It's not destiny. You're not the person who collapsed. You're the person who's crossing. And there's a crucial difference. One is fixed identity. The other is movement. And here's the test. If you're using nihilism as an excuse not to act, not to create, not to commit, then you're stuck. But if you're using it as a cleansing process, as necessary demolition, then you're crossing. The difference isn't in what you feel, it's in what you do. So how do you get out? How do you cross without getting stuck? Nietzsche had an answer. Meaning isn't something you find, it's something you create. It doesn't exist out there waiting. You have to build it, from your choices. This changes everything, because you stop searching. You stop waiting for someone to give you the answer. You stop seeking external validation. You take total responsibility for the creation of meaning. And that's terrifying and liberating at the same time. Terrifying because you're alone. No one can do this for you. You might be building sandcastles. You'll never have absolute certainty. But it's also liberating, because you no longer need to wait for permission. You no longer need to fit in. You can simply choose, create, affirm. And here's something fundamental. Creating meaning doesn't mean inventing something from nothing. It means actively deciding what's going to matter to you, where you're going to invest your energy, what you're going to defend. And these decisions are what give meaning to life. It's not meaning that was hidden. It's meaning that emerges through your actions, through your commitments. And this meaning is real, not because it corresponds to cosmic truth, but because you created it, because you live it. And there's a price. This path leads to solitude. Not necessarily physical solitude, but existential solitude. When you stop following the group's values, you inevitably distance yourself, because the people around you are still playing the old game. And when you question, you become less understandable. This doesn't mean you're better or worse. It just means you're in a different place. Most people prefer the security of the known, and there's no moral superiority in making or not making this crossing. But if you're making it, it's important to understand. Solitude isn't a sign of error. It's a natural consequence of autonomy. This solitude has specific texture. It's not just being alone. It's feeling that no one else understands, that you're in a territory few visit, and that can be isolating in a profound way, because human beings need connection. And there are moments when you'll wonder if it's worth it, if it wouldn't be easier to go back, to fit in again. At least you'd have company. But the truth is, you can't go back. Not really. Because once you've seen through the illusion, you can't believe the same way anymore. You can even try. You can try to return to old values, to old roles. But it doesn't work, because you know too much. You've seen too much. You've changed too much. And pretending has a high cost. The cost of living in a conscious lie. And that cost becomes greater than the cost of solitude. And then, after crossing the emptiness, something begins to emerge. But not the way you imagined. Not as a clear answer. Not as sudden epiphany. It emerges as direction. Vague at first. Almost imperceptible. Like a small inclination. Like a subtle impulse you don't rationally explain but recognize as true. Not because someone told you, but because it resonates with something deep in you. With something that survived the breakdown. And you begin to follow this direction. Not with absolute certainty. Not knowing if you're right. But because it's the only possible movement. And as you follow, something solidifies. Not as final truth, but as a path you're creating by walking. Life regains weight. Not because you found the true meaning, but because you're creating meaning through your choices. And maybe that's the only truth that survives breakdown. The truth that you're capable of creating, of building, of affirming. Even when there's no solid ground. Maybe you'll never find the definitive answer. Maybe you'll never have absolute certainty. Maybe you'll always live with some level of doubt. But that doesn't make life meaningless. It just makes meaning something you create actively, instead of something you discover once and follow forever. And there's something deeply liberating in that. When you stop seeking perfect meaning, the definitive answer, absolute truth, you become free to live, to experiment, to create, to err, to correct. You become free to be human. If you're going through this now, I'm not going to say everything will be okay. I'm not going to promise you'll find answers. I'm not going to offer easy solutions. Because they don't exist. There's no shortcut. You have to cross it. And it hurts. But I can say that this experience isn't failure. It's not a sign you did something wrong. It's a sign you're in transition. That you've grown beyond the old structures. And everyone who really transformed went through something similar. Crossed the desert. Inhabited the emptiness. And came out the other side more alive. More authentic. And maybe the only real thing that can be said is this. You have the capacity to cross. Even when it seems impossible. And when you finally pass through, when you start creating your own values, you'll look back and understand. Everything that needed to crumble, crumbled. Everything that needed to die, died, so something new could be born. The breakdown is the opportunity to create meaning in a more authentic way. And maybe that's what Nietzsche meant from the beginning. That some things need to fall, not to destroy you, but to free you.